will have two parts. So I'm setting the scene in the beginning. So I will introduce the Beyond Hot Air project, of which Emma and I'm part of. And then I will set the scene in terms of what is the Critical Raw Materials Act of the European Union. And then I will talk briefly about the constructions of greening, the green energy transition, and the criticality of critical raw materials. And then Emma will talk in the second part about just transition and the prerequisites of social dialogue and the negotiations around whose costs and whose benefits are associated to critical mineral extraction. And social dialogue is the most difficult part of green or of just transition. And then Emma will introduce us to two examples in Sápmi. Sápmi is the homeland of Europe's only actually recognized indigenous people, the Sámi people. And Sápmi stretches from the north of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the western part of Russia. So, and there is in Sápmi a huge run after natural resources. And Emma will talk about a gold and copper project in the municipality of Kautokeino, and also about the iron ore project called Gallak in Jokkmokk in Sweden. And so our conclusion will be that the terms of social dialogue depend on visions of just transition, and these visions can be conflicting, can be very diverse. And
sorry.
Oh, thank you. And to ensure just transition, a social dialogue needs to balance power relations. So in the end, of course, it's a no-brainer. It's always about power relations. And Emma will talk and talk us in more detail through the notions of indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, because just transition requires transformation, broader transformation. And this transformation must include recognition of indigenous sovereignty and self-determination in order to achieve really a just transition. So what is Beyond Hot Air? So we are a bunch of scholars from a multitude of institutions. You see this here on the banner on the bottom of this slide. We have colleagues from Australia, from Sápmi, from Norway, from Canada, Austria, from France at the Sorbonne, from Finland at the London University, Austrian Polar Research Institute, and Emma's company, ECW Energy. So Beyond Hot Air, as we define ourselves, we are a conversation. We want to converse, and we want to think creatively about the fairness and equity of mining of critical raw materials. So, and Beyond Hot Air, we came together around 2 years ago, and we want to challenge accepted notions. We want to unravel contradictions and paradoxes around energy transition, the green transition, the green industries, around dialogue and consultation and social license to operate. So we have here a quote from Emilka and Nick Baton, which says, simply put, the prevailing pathway to address climate change locks in an extractive hegemony, whereby mining becomes essential for the planetary survival. So, we want to talk about this mental lock-in in Beyond Hot Air. And in our mission statement, we say, through listening, sharing, and mutual learning across group who do not necessarily start on the same page or share similar worldviews. So that's why, for instance, you see here at the pictures a workshop that we had last year in Vienna where we had company representatives, policymakers, bureaucrats. We had NGO activists, indigenous and non-indigenous NGO representatives, scholars, media people, in a 2 days workshop. And this was, as you see here, it was really a hands-on workshop as well. And it was really a very respectful gathering, also of people who are, not on the same page. And I think this was kind of a success, that we could exchange ideas and access mutually our minds. So what we try is to talk across disciplines. In our group, we have natural scientists, meaning geology, and various social sciences. And we also do research and work on cases in Sápmi, in Austria, as an example for Central European mining, New Caledonia and Canada. So, and we have a conversation platform, and I would like to take this opportunity right now to invite you to contribute a video, to contribute with a blog post. We have webinars, so workshops, and for instance, you see at the bottom of, right at the bottom of the page, we had a big event at the Museum of Natural History in Vienna, where we had speakers from Canada and Norway, Sápmi, to talk about green extractivism and green colonialism. And here the mining picture is an excursion with students. We took the students to the lithium mine in Austria, which is still not operating, but they promise it. So, okay, why is conversation around mining needed in Europe? So, Kirinov Fakale said, well, the relevant question relates to where mining should occur and should not occur, and the conditions under which mining should occur. And the CEO of Boliden, raised or put the finger on the fact that Europe extracts just 3% of most raw materials, and it consumes 20% nearly of them. And in the yellow box, you see that in 1900, Europe accounted for more than 50% of global mineral production, and falling under 5% in 2018. So this is the whole spin around European mining. So should we mine in our backyard, or should we continue, or we probably must continue to mine in other people's backyard in other places on the globe? So the conversation has a few aspects that we should consider also in the talk today. So energy transition technology depends on critical raw materials. Then we have geopolitical shifts. So we talk a lot about green transition and energy transition and digitalization, and for which the critical raw materials are needed, but they are also needed for the defense and the aerospace industries. And this is, of course, in our days now, very important to consider that this is also part of it. And this is not a nice spin around critical raw materials as we have it. So, and one other important aspect is that the existing industrial demand in conventional sectors is also growing, but this is not part of the discussions very often. Also, the European Union and the reports and the projections consider mostly the demands or count the demands of regarding the new sectors, but we have to keep in mind that the conventional sectors are also growing. So, and another spin is the consumption growth and economic growth is seemingly inevitable, and we have to question this as well. And then another point is mining in Europe. It aims to reduce dependency and secure supply chains. And then the final questions we need to converse about is who carries the social and ecological costs, and who should sacrifice for whom. And this relates in particular to peripheries, also peripheries within the European Union, but of course also in the global south, which regions become mining frontiers. So, and here just the Critical Raw Materials Act that was passed in April 2024 says that 10% of extraction of strategic raw materials demand should come from European Union mining operations. Then another important point is that processing capacity of strategic raw materials should be 40%. And then 25% of EU demand of strategic materials should come from recycling. And a maximum of 65% of strategic raw materials should come from only 1/3 country. So these are really ambitious goals, and it requires, this says the Critical Raw Materials Act and the associated policies, that we need now comprehensive exploration in the European Union. So the geological surveys of the individual nation states, countries, European countries are called to do more research, to do geological surveys targeting at the strategic raw materials. And then a highly disputed point is that the Critical Raw Materials Act allows for faster approval procedures, and the time frame for this is 2030. So let's keep in mind we have 2026. So what are strategic materials compared to critical raw materials? So the European Union has designated 35 critical raw materials, and out of these are 17 strategic raw materials. And these are strategic for the sectors of technologies and renewable energy, digitization, aerospace, and defense. And these strategic, so operators, proponents can apply for a strategic project status, and the European Commission, at the European Commission level, and these projects must be or are then of public interest. So, but we have some problems with that because the selection criteria for labeling a strategic project is not really disclosed, and we will see what list comes out. It's not yet there. I looked up yesterday and it was not yet there on the website of the European Commission. So it should be announced early 2025. A very important aspect is that the permitting process is now limited to 27 months for extraction and 15 months for processing and recycling. So the whole idea is fast tracking. And also for the environmental impact assessment process, it's also the idea to accelerate this process. So we also have here limits. So the evaluation of the need to have an environmental impact assessment is maximum 30 days. So it's now lower than before. And it's not every mine or not every operation needs an environmental impact assessment. So just for those who don't know that. So you have to evaluate this need. Then the public consultation is limited to 85 days, and the decision period is limited to 90 days. So it's 20 past, so I go on. And yeah, this is just a slide, an example of European Lithium, a company operating in Austria, and they say European Lithium aims to fast track the development of the project and so on. So here you see the first contradiction, because the company promised lithium processing in Austria and to build a plant. But now, due to changes of ownership of the company, suddenly the plans for processing are to ship the ore out to Saudi Arabia. So we can ask, how European is this, and how safe in the end is the supply for Europe when, you know, when the whole processing chain is not located in Europe. So, and coming back to Beyond Hot Air, so our colleague from geology, Frank Melcher, revisited the study of the European Union around the critical raw materials demand and supply. And just to mention, and this is really critical. So he said, I mean, it's nearly impossible to meet all these requirements. And I invite you to read our briefing paper #1 of Frank. Just one example is graphite. It would be graphite would need to be increased by 15% annually for the next 10 years at least. So 5 to 10 new mines would need to go into operation every year in order to reach the projected demands under the 2030 and 2050 scenarios. But we also know that the lead time of a project is around 15 to 15 years. So until you develop a mine, I mean, this is really, it takes a long time. And then we have the question. So our colleague Gabriel and Erika were talking about the construction of criticality. So who defines what is critical or not? And Gabriel criticizes in his dissertation work that this standardized technical bureaucratic act is not neutral, but it's hidden under the technical language, and this is kind of misleading. And he says that so he revealed in his research that the stakeholder dialogues by the European Union to define this criticality was, of course, dominated by industrial actors. So, and with this slide over to Emma, and yeah, we will see that, yeah, you will talk about the consultation processes and the examples and, yeah, what needs just transition.
Thank you, Gerti. Yes, good to see everyone. Thank you very much for coming. And thank you, Gerti, for that introduction. What I'm going to talk about now is basically the just transition. First of all, what is a just transition? The International Labour Organization guidelines suggest that it's about decent work for all, social inclusion and the eradication of poverty. And a core aspect of that is social dialogue, and that's what we're particularly looking at today, the social dialogue element. And typically that, in the sort of typical just transition worker-focused agenda, it's tripartite social dialogue between unions, employers and the government. But more recently, the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights has been looking at the just transition, expanding it very much more to look at human rights, in particular focusing on Indigenous peoples and people affected by energy poverty. And again, the way to address and ensure a good just transition is through social dialogue and meaningful participation, particularly in decision-making on land use and natural resources. And they do acknowledge that the people who are going to benefit most from the transition are not necessarily the people, the people who are most negatively affected by the transition are not necessarily the ones who are going to benefit most. And so they do accept that the whole transition process could be very unfair. And here we have 3 Indigenous Just Transition declarations. You can look those up yourselves, but you can see that the terminology and the agenda is much more transformational. And they're looking at creating new relationships of power for the future, transformation of the systems that have historically and continually disempowered Indigenous peoples, and looking for our own forms of territorial governance. And so also academics have been looking at typologies of justice when they've been looking at just transitions. Mostly people are settling on procedural, distributive and restorative justice, but recognitional and cosmopolitan justice have also been covered and are also under consideration, and it's worth thinking about them. But the most interesting thing at the moment for me is the understanding that the application of one type of justice depends on the prior application of another type of justice, and so therefore Heffron and Macaulay are talking about distributional justice needing to have restorative justice happening beforehand in order for the distributional aspects of a transition to be just. And Loginova et al. Have been talking about the balance of procedural power. So just having procedures themselves is not a guarantee of justice. So I'm going to borrow some conclusions from a research project I recently did for a certification initiative. And this entailed looking at 16 just transition frameworks, including the 3 Indigenous ones, but also ones by the UN, business-facing platforms, private sector, and looking at some of the common transition principles across those. And these are some of the most common ones. You can see mostly falling under procedural and distributive justice. Social dialogue, meaningful stakeholder consultation and engagement are very commonly found in these frameworks. But the research was also supported by a lot of case study analysis. And what frequently, consistently comes out of the case study analysis is that there is a consistent failure to implement social dialogue, meaningful stakeholder consultation and engagement adequately in practice. And there's still a very poor understanding of what it means to do so. And as Gerti was talking about, the issues of timing and urgency are not adequately addressed in discussions around what social dialogue means. So here we have a look at common and less common principles, and you see that some of the less common principles relate to issues around Indigenous engagement and consultation and restorative justice. And some people, when we were discussing this finding, said, well, there is special attention to vulnerable and marginalised groups, and perhaps that covers Indigenous people's issues. But I think the point to be made here is that Indigenous peoples are not only to be conceived of as vulnerable and marginalised. The questions relate very much to sovereignty and self-determination, and these questions are frequently overlooked in corporate due diligence and in general in transition studies. So what we have is a sort of wide scope or scale of just transition ambitions, and there's no real sort of single vision of what a just transition should be, or even what a transition should be. And so the basic one is decarbonisation. It's looking at transitioning out of high carbon industries, transitioning into new low carbon industries, including CRM mining. It's talking about engagement with workers, businesses and government, but also looking at affected local people with a focus on the vulnerable and marginalised. It's about public consultation, environmental and social impact assessments, and that's a fairly standard way of looking at it. The more transformational agenda is seeing the transition as being a systemic change in society and the economy, looking at consumption reduction, land rights, decolonialism, sovereignty and self-determination, environmental legacies and historic reparations. And the dialogue should be including all societal stakeholders, or different dialogues at different times as well. And it should be the rights holders and the stakeholders themselves who are driving the transitions. So some of the tools for that kind of dialogue is public dialogues, large-scale public consultations, strategic impact assessments at the programme level when governments are developing programmes, and free, prior and informed consent in the full and proper meaning of the term. So the economic lens is the way in which transitions are often viewed. So many of us already know Nicholas Stern. He's quoted, he's quite influential in this sphere, but he presents and envisions the just transition as part of a new, inclusive, sustainable growth model, calling it a highly attractive economic model. And changing the process, managing the processes of change is still within modern market economies. Heffron and Macaulay challenged that kind of approach, saying traditional economics has never really delivered positive, just outcomes for society. If anything, it has significantly added to social inequality. So the big question, will fast tracking save time? Gerti was talking about fast tracking. That's a big idea in the the European transitional policy. Again, Nicholas Stern, apologies for calling him out again, but he's calling for accelerating the pace of decision making. Yes, we do. There is urgency in responding to climate change. But Owen et al. Talking about the question is whether and to what extent community consultation and consent will be compromised in the process of this urgent fast-tracking model. And then the Indigenous Peoples Principles and Protocols for Just Transition, one of those declarations that we mentioned, they call for, they said we will continue to challenge these decisions if they're going to fast-track processes, projects, without our free, prior and informed consent, without the appropriate socio-cultural and environmental review processes. And they argue against calling things public interest or national interest without duly taking into account what that means and how it affects other people's rights. So to move towards our case studies here, this is a map, critical raw materials. It's available online throughout Europe. This is a map of the Sápmi area. The red area is Sápmi. You can see that the minerals are found throughout Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And this is also Sápmi, this part of Russia. So that's just a sort of, I'm not a geologist, so I can't tell you more than that. But it shows that there are minerals all around these countries. So the case studies, we're looking at Norway and Sweden to compare. Norway has ratified the ILO Convention 169 on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples. Sweden hasn't ratified it, but there are many calls for it to do so. But they both ratified these international human rights treaties, including significantly in Sweden's case, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which is a tool that Indigenous people are able to use in their, to promote their interests. They both voted in favour of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They both have, well, Norway has a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Sweden has a Truth Commission, supposedly reconciliation is going to come later. Norway is not a member of the EU, Sweden is, but Norway has a lot of obligations as part of the European Economic Area. Specifically to Norway, they have the Finnmark Act, which shifted Crown lands to the collective ownership of the Finnmark estate to be jointly governed by the Sámi Parliament and the Swedish government, recognising that within Sápmi there are a lot of Sámi people, but also non-Sámi people, and you need to take into account everybody's needs. And in Norway, the Planning and Building Act, which is a specific, it's of specific interest for the case study we're going to look at, because it defines devolved decision-making in certain respects. It does have a special paragraph on protecting Sámi culture as well, which is significant. So we're going to move straight to the Norway case study. This is the Byjavåg copper gold project located in Kautokeino County, in Kautokeino municipality, part of Finnmark County, which is the Sámi county. And the population of the municipality is to about 2,850. Half the population are directly linked to reindeer herding. Most of them speak Sámi. The herding itself is important for culture and language. They previously had a gold mine, which was opened in the 1970s and 80s, and which was seen as beneficial, certainly by some people, but it was a threat to the reindeer herding. And they also have and consistently talk about cumulative impacts from not only mining, but wind farms, electric power lines, tourism huts. People come and they build their huts to go to have a nice weekend away or a week away. So these issues are all ongoing. The particular case study, I did some research 10 years ago in this area, and I went and visited. But it's quite interesting because that was a period when the decision-making process was particularly interesting. And frankly, nothing much has happened on the actual project since then. And I think considering the timing of these projects, they are extremely, large expanses of time. So 10 years can pass quite quickly. So in the first place, it took Arctic Gold 10 years to secure their first exploration license. And this was granted by the national government without consulting with the community. But then the crux of this case study is that the decision to allow the company to do an environmental impact assessment lay in the hands of the municipal council. And so the municipality twice voted. The council is about 19 people. You can see they're all different types, different parties they represent. And so they came together with very different perspectives. And the voting was quite close. But they all appreciated that reindeer herding was a significant and valuable aspect of the local economy. And there weren't many other, well, mining could provide an alternative, but it's not a guaranteed alternative. And it would also threaten the reindeer herding. So it's not seen as an overall positive potential development. And the critical thing about this decision, people were saying, well, you may as well do an environmental impact assessment. At least you'd know what the impacts and the risks are. And then the municipality answered, well, yes, we would, but then the power would shift to, once they've done an impact assessment, the power would shift to the national government. So by not making this decision, not allowing this, they kept the power in their own hands. Arctic Girl challenged the legality of the decision unsuccessfully 3 times. And then when I was there, it was just after these elections, and the municipality declared a 4-year moratorium on further discussion, hoping people could then focus on something else. And I think one of the challenges people were talking to us about was, people aren't thinking of anything but this potential mine, and there's so many other opportunities for environmental development. However, there's an update. In 2021, the government issued 6 new exploration licenses, again without consultation. They don't have to legally. 2022, significant metals discovery. We're talking about cobalt and tellurium now, important for batteries to electric vehicles. And then the challenge back is that this is all green colonialism, threatening Indigenous people's lifestyles. So the battle is back on. There was in February 2024, there was a Sápmi business conference where the government was urging people to develop economic plans for the Sámi. And this is the CEO of Arctic Minerals now. It's not called Arctic Gold, but Arctic Minerals, saying, we're going to take up the invitation to develop business proposals for the Kautokeino region. So they still feel as though they're players in the area. So now moving on to Sweden. One of the big issues that comes up in Sweden is this notion of national interest, and we're talking about balancing costs and benefits and interests. And they have this system of designating territories as being of national interest. And that has a very interesting influence on what happens. The Galok project, I'll go through this quickly, is an iron ore project. The reason it's interesting for the transition is because because Sweden has this low carbon, fossil-free steelmaking aspiration, and they're developing fossil-free steelmaking. This area has 3 national interest designations, and I'll explain in the next slide. And it's become, the Galop project has become a major campaign for the Sámi because it relates not only to this one mine site, but also to their rights more widely. This picture is from Greta Thunberg on Twitter. She's got heavily involved in the campaign. And again, it's the question of cumulative impacts. It's the mining, wind farms. So the mining and wind farms are all part of this sort of transition to the low carbon economy, which they call green colonialism. So this, you don't need to be able to read all of this, but essentially, this is a sort of timeline of the project, and you get moments, these blue moments here, where permissions were granted, and then at the top, it's all the opposition, national opposition specifically from the Sámi statements saying we do not want this to happen, public protests. And then this is sort of various different types of engagement, conversations. There's regular engagement with the herders from the Norrbotten County Administrative Board, but there's sporadic engagement between the company and the herders. And then when this exploitation concession was granted, there was no recognition of all of this opposition. And the concession was granted with sort of fairly heavy requirements on the company to carry out due diligence and consultation with the reindeer herders. So essentially ignoring the conflict and then putting the conflict on the company to sort out with the reindeer herders, which is quite typical of what happens. But this is an example, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights stating we're very concerned by the lack of good faith consultations and the failure to obtain the free, prior and informed consent of the Sámi. This is a missed opportunity. That was a local area plan which focused mostly on wind farms and didn't say anything about the mine. This is a really interesting example of citizen dialogues. There was a very rich citizen dialogue held by the local municipality. The transcripts reveal diverse sentiment, conflicts, but also a real desire for constructive dialogue. But then you have the municipality not recognising that diversity of opinion in their own submission to the exploitation concession. And even in the dialogues, they stated that as the political majority, we are positive about the mine, but not without conditions. And so they didn't sort of reflect any of the conflict. The update here is that the government of Sweden has defended its decision, because the real question, I don't know whether it comes here, these areas of national interest, that's where it was declared an area of national interest for reindeer herding. So this one here, it's a national interest for reindeer herding, but it didn't cover the actual mine site. This is where in 2013, the mine site was declared an area of national interest for mining. And then the Sámi declared the same area as a national interest for reindeer herding. And so in this exploitation concession, the government had to weigh up these national interests. And so it ruled in favour of mining being a stronger national interest. And so then the government stood by its original decision, 2024, and Beowulf on its website, that's the mother company or whatever of the Swedish subsidiary, and they said, you know, they welcome this decision, but the court case is actually nothing to do with them. It's the government versus the reindeer herders. Next steps for Gallock. The Indigenous people could apply to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in a similar case. This happened in the Rumbeck and Nickel case. And if you look at the date of communication and the date of opinion, that's another 7 years. So if you're talking about fast tracking, trying to get through things, you know, by fast tracking decision making, there's really lots of reasons why it's not going to work. And so here are different levels of social dialogue, starting with historical reparations, sovereignty and land rights. And then if these are done properly, then you will take a lot of pressure from there. And it may not even happen if you've already decided. You can save companies a lot of time. So if you apply restorative justice here, you can have procedural justice, not only for the local people, but also for the companies. So our conclusions, essentially, urgency leads to efforts to promote fast tracking, legal challenges slow it down, and to ensure procedural justice, you need to ensure restorative and recognition justice beforehand, and you can't hurry trust. So that, sorry, we went in a bit long, but yes, thank you.